My name's Marin Gamble. I'm a Health and Safety Management Systems Consultant in the core department at the IHSA. I'm going to talk today about the idea of document and record control in the core 2020 audit tool. The audit tool that I'm using when I'm recording this today on April 21st in 2022 is the audit tool that was dated in June 2020. Document and record control relates to a concept that is new to Core 2020 if you compare it to the previous core standard that was available in Ontario. And so it's one that we really want to take a few minutes just to focus on directly to go through and talk to anybody who's interested. So what I want to do to that end is navigate in this Core 2020 audit tool to element 1 here, which says Health and Safety Policy on the tab. But when you go there, you'll notice that there's this 1.1 is health and safety policy. But if you actually scroll down to the bottom half, 1.2 is document and record control. So in this sense, we see that document and record control is described as a document and record control procedure, provides direction to track, manage, and store documents and records, and assists with accuracy and due diligence. Within there's 2 very important words that have been bolded, document and record. In order to find a definition for those, anything that is bolded can be found as a definition within the tool. I will actually just go along the bottom, scrolling past all the other elements to this tab here that says definitions. Within that tab, I can look up document. So here we find out that it's a medium containing information related to the occupational health and safety management system. I can also scroll down and look up record. Here it is. A record is a document stating the results achieved or providing evidence of activities performed. Okay, so armed with our definitions, what exactly does that mean in terms of real application? So when we go here, in terms of approaching this core concept, I'd say that when we're talking about documents, we're really talking about the pieces that are built into your manual, your system, the things that you build in advance of needing them, the procedures you plan for, the forms that you create in terms of blank templates, the things that are reviewed on an annual basis, at least as part of your management review. It's your policies, your procedures, your guidelines, your forms. It's the documentation that forms the basis of your system. When we talk about records, on the other hand, it's now when the forms that you've created have been filled out. So a record is something that has been completed due to the necessary trigger occurring in terms of your system. So if your system describes in a document, a procedure for conducting a weekly field inspection, then you may have records, hopefully you do have records, of completed weekly inspections that are being completed according to the template that you created for that and the procedure that you recorded for that. So really when we're looking at it, there's sort of 2 sides of a coin or two pieces of a puzzle, where the documents are sort of all those planning preemptive documents that are created, and then the records are the completed forms, the completed records when those situations do occur in real life. So 1.2 here, then, that we've scrolled to, it does specifically talk about a procedure requirement for document and record control. So does your organization have a written procedure for documentation, document control, and record control that includes? And several different requirements are outlined here that we'll talk about in a few minutes. This is a procedure for how you will be managing your document and record control. In 1.2, that's actually the end of the element. There's no follow-up questions to that. And the reason for that is because as you go through the other elements here, so I'm just going to, as an example, click on element 2 now, and you scroll to the very last question of each of these elements, they all have this same language, essentially, just one element to the next, where, in this case, it's hazard assessment. It says, are documents and records maintained per the procedures in 1.2, document and record control? go to 3, which is controls, again, I'm going to find the same language. Are documents and records maintained per the procedure in 1.2? So this procedure that we see back here in 1.2 is actually being validated in implementation through each of the other elements, through the specific documents and specific records that the procedures in those elements are actually going to outline. You'll notice in all those procedures, they also do talk about specifying documents and specifying forms. And so there is sort of an interrelationship between that procedure that you outline in 1.2 and each of the independent sections of this system. Returning here then to 1.2, document and record control, where that specific procedure is, this is going to be a very important section for us to go through, come up with a lot of detail, ask and answer the necessary questions, and develop a really meaningful procedure to address this topic. So you'll notice here that there's clauses A through K that need to be addressed for scoring on this procedure. The procedure in total is worth 11 marks. Each of these different requirements, items, clauses is worth a possible 1 point for a total out of 11 that could be, partial scoring out of 11. So you may be able to validate some of these clauses and not others. And that might leave you some room, even within a topic that you have, a functioning base system, you may leave yourself with some room for improvement over time, depending on where your current strengths are in your system. So how do we approach a procedure like this? How am I going to approach building a procedure for document and record control? Really, I'm going to look at clause A there. If you can see it here, it says roles and responsibilities. So does your organization have a written procedure for documentation, document control, and record control that includes roles and responsibilities? You'll notice again, as you go through, this is a common format for procedures. All these procedure questions throughout this audit tool that we have for Core 2020, that clause A is roles and responsibilities because that is a common feature that they should all have. I mentioned a few moments ago that describing forms, describing record keeping, that's going to be a common feature of these elements as well. Looking at clause A here then for document and record control, we want to know who's going to do what in order to achieve our ultimate goals with respect to document control and record control. What are the ultimate goals? Well, in terms of Core 2020, the ultimate goals are these clauses that are outlined. These are the items that have been established as part of this audit as critical pieces for this program. So with respect to roles and responsibilities, I need to start looking at these other clauses and say, who is going to do this? And the answer might be one person. The answer might be several people. But we really want to look at who's taking the ultimate accountability at the end of the day for this piece of the puzzle being carried out. So looking at clause B. Clause B says that there needs to be a written procedure for documents and records determined by your organization to be necessary for the effectiveness of your system. I'm going to ask myself, who is responsible for overseeing that process for identifying the documents and records that are necessary for the effectiveness of the occupational health and safety management system? I'm just asking myself, who's going to do that? Who's going to be ultimately accountable for that? Look at clause C. Who is going to be responsible for approving documents prior to issue? Who is going to be responsible for the process of reviewing, updating, reapproving, or withdrawing documents as necessary? I'm just going one clause after the other and asking myself, who's responsible for this? And that's how I'm building those roles and responsibilities all the way through to clause K, where it says the requirement to ensure documents and records remain legible and readily identifiable. Again, who is responsible for the process of ensuring that they are legible and readily identifiable? You can apply this to all these clauses and make sure that those as a minimum are associated with specific roles and that there are specific individuals accountable to ensuring that those are being carried out. Can you include additional things? Of course you can. these are sort of the bare minimum items that we want to see in there. And we expect that when you develop your system for this, there's going to be extra pieces to this that you're going to fit in. And that's reasonable, that makes sense, that's expected. But these are going to be sort of the basic fundamental starting point questions that you can ask yourself. I think it's also important to talk about what your answer is when you ask who. So when you're looking at the roles that you're going to include in these different sections, I think it's also important to look at your organizational chart that you have in front of you. It's important that when someone flips to any procedure, including this procedure, that when they look at it, they understand where their particular job title fits into the description that you have. So if you have broad categories of people such as senior management, supervisor, worker, okay, but if you have 15 job titles, how do they slot into those 3 categories? Some people might end up finding it ambiguous for themselves, whether they're senior management or they're a supervisor, are they a worker or a supervisor? Just make sure that those roles are clearly defined so that when the staff themselves are opening it up and looking for their own responsibilities, that they find it user-friendly. In terms of it being readable for core review, that's really secondary. You can tell us how you've defined things that make it workable in your organization. You can use your organizational chart to define those things for us and just help us understand what language you're using rather than trying to fit into a sense of what the legal language is for certain things. So, that was kind of clause A, who's going to do what. So once we've determined who is responsible for the different pieces of this, we need to figure out how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and what the expectations of that are. So it won't be enough for us to just say, the senior manager, the president is going to approve. It's not going to be enough to say the senior manager is going to identify documents of external origin. We need to know how they're going to do that, when they're going to do it, how's it going to be recorded, and really tell a story around your process for achieving this. Don't be afraid to leverage existing processes that you have in your system. So if you've already got the right people in the room when you're doing management review for some of these things, okay, so maybe it can be worked into your management review. Same of your joint health and safety committee. You've got a great group of individuals there working on your committee that can help with some of these topics. So don't be afraid to think about what you already do that approaches these things and write your story to fit that. It's going to help you answer who is going to do these things by leveraging those existing processes. So if I look at clause B there, where it's talking about a procedure for documents and records determined by your organization to be necessary for the effectiveness of the occupational health and safety management system, we're really asking in this question, how are you doing this? Who's going to be there, and what is the process they're going to go through to determine the documents and records that are necessary, as well as how are they going to record that? How are they maintaining that information? Who does that get communicated to? Really ask yourself a full story around this topic, the who, what, where, when, and how of this being carried out, and go through that for each clause. I will say though, bear in mind these clauses aren't chronological. They don't follow a flow from first to last necessarily. These are things that need to appear somewhere, but you might find that some of them group naturally in your system and not in, an alphabetical order. So you might find that, a few clauses are appropriate at management review, a few are done by the health and safety department, a few the supervisors take care of. Whatever the process that works based on your structure is, that's how you're probably going to write it so that it makes sense as a procedure for your staff. You'll know where it is in your procedure, you'll be able to highlight it for us, and that's not a problem. So don't expect them necessarily to go in order, but do think about each of these things, give them each their own moment to determine how you do them. You might already be doing them, and just write down that story. So if I look at clause C, just like I looked at clause B, a procedure for the requirement to ensure documents are approved prior to use. It's not going to be enough to say we require approval prior to use. We're going to need to know your process to ensure that that requirement is carried out. So again, who, what, where, when, and how is this being carried out? So make sure there's a full description around it. Clause D, the requirement to review, update, reapprove, or withdraw documents is necessary. We ask and we answer what process will be followed to review, update, reapprove, or withdraw documents as necessary. Who, what, where, when, and how. And you're going to go through these very much making sure that they're each addressed and answer all these questions. When it comes to validating these in each element, we do get a lot of questions around, okay, we've come up with a plan. What does that look like in terms of the different elements? Well, consider even clause B that we already talked about here. The documents and records determined by your organization to be necessary for the effectiveness. Well, when we're talking about what those documents and records are, the documents are going to be these things that are outlined in the subsequent elements. So these policies, these procedures, the different blank forms, the records are going to be the different records that are produced as outputs of these procedures. Like in this one, I just clicked here in element 2, specific forms for recording the hazard assessments. So in element 2, one of the things that would logically pop out of looking at this and going through that process of determining necessary documents and records, one of the documents would likely be, our hazard assessment form, and one of the records would be those recorded, completed hazard assessment documents. So when we look at element 2 and we're looking at our documents and records maintained per the procedures in 1.2, what we're really saying is how have all of these requirements been applied now to this subsection of documents and records that are defined in your element 2 procedure or your element 3 procedure, and so on and so forth throughout. So, the requirement for approval that's attributed to documents in 1.2. Well, whatever you've said that requirement for approval is going to be, you're going to be able to demonstrate that for the documents in element 2. Updates reviewed, revision statuses, legibility, identifiability, all of these different things you can show as they fit into the specific documents and the specific records for the given topic. I looked at element 2 here for a moment, but if I go to element 3, and again, just scroll up to the procedure for a minute, specific forms for documenting controls. So again, we're going to have policies, procedures, we're going to have practices and procedures that are outputs from this element, and those specific forms for documenting controls, where we will have records that are produced as outputs from this. So you look at what the procedure puts out for the specific topics, and that's what you're showing us has been documented and recorded according to that procedure in 1.2. Popping back here real quick to 1.2, the procedure question. There's a couple questions in here that I know sometimes give clients a bit of pause in terms of what they're looking for. So just jumping to clause I here, the requirement for identification and retention of records. So again, these are your completed records that are sort of the outputs of the different procedures, as necessary to demonstrate conformity requirements. This is going to ask you to answer questions like, which records do need to be kept? How long do those records need to be kept? And where will those records be kept? Who's responsible for keeping them? Different documents might have different retention requirements, and it's up to your organization to determine what is appropriate for you and how that's going to be dealt with. Looking at clause J as well, the idea of the requirement for protection of privacy and confidentiality. We do see this as one that tempts a lot of people to, sort of state it is required to maintain confidentiality. But in terms of your procedure here, we're interested in, how are you identifying what documents and records fall under that requirement for privacy and confidentiality? Who maintains that? Who has access to the different documents? Where is it going to be maintained to ensure that that privacy and that confidentiality is maintained? And really looking at it as an organization to say, is there any legal requirements that dictate this? Is there a company threshold that we're going to use for when things need to be protected? and defining that clearly in your procedure for when the requirement applies and how it is applied as an organization. Legibility is another one I get asked about a decent amount in terms of K here. There's different ways of talking about this. I'd say that some of the common ways of describing a process around legibility, if you have an electronic system of some sort where, you know, it's a computer-based digital entry, generally legibility is protected by the fact that, you know, a keyboard is doing the work for us. And that might be your process around maintaining legibility. It may also be if you have a system that is, you know, either hard copy based or relies on photographs of documentation, that there's a regular collection of site-based documents to ensure that, you know, resolution is high enough on photographs to ensure that, you know, a paper doesn't disappear under the front seat of a vehicle or get too many coffee stains on it to remain legible. You know, there might be a process of just regular collection to ensure that legibility. So just think about what you're doing to maintain a basic level of legibility on your documentation and your records in terms of what you're doing. So just to kind of summarize, I guess, where we're at in terms of this particular conversation around document and record control, the procedure is outlined in this section 1.2, which is a sub-element in element 1 within the Core 2020 audit tool. And then the implementation is found in the very last question of every other element as you go throughout, as you scroll to the bottom. You do need to demonstrate in those questions adherence to the procedure in 1.2, and you do need to follow the sampling guidelines for the core audit. So we would be looking for 3 samples, 3 consecutive samples if it's something where frequency is included, and demonstrate to us how that ties into your procedure. If you have any further questions on this topic or any other topic to do with your Core 2020 audit, please don't hesitate to reach out to core@IHSA.ca.